All right, thousands of mourners are indeed attending that funeral service of the Al Jazeera journalist who witnesses say was shot dead by Israeli forces, something Israel denies earlier this week while covering the military operation in the occupied West Bank. Earlier, Israeli police clashed with Palestinian mourners packed around the coffin of the murdered Al Jazeera reporter at the start of her funeral procession in Jerusalem. Footage showed masked police officers faced scores of flag-waving and chanting Palestinians in the compound of St. Joseph's Hospital in Israeli East Jerusalem. All right, well, so those are the live visuals there. Let's get more on this then and discuss the issue of the safety of journalists. And when I joined via Zoom by the Director for Media Monitoring Africa, Mr. William Bird, weigh in on this tragedy in which an Al Jazeera correspondent, Shireen Abu Akleh, was shot while covering a raid by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank. We'll be unpacking the safety concerns for journalists covering stories in war-torn areas. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Bird. Thanks very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me on the program.
You're most welcome. First, what is your take, on this incident as media monitoring? I mean, we often hear of these incidents where journalists really put themselves in the line of fire to bring, the stories to us, and certainly this is one of those.
Yeah, it speaks to just how dangerous it is being a journalist, quite frankly. And often we forget these things until you hear about these horrific incidents where, a journalist merely for doing a job has been killed. And that's just, it highlights the importance of what journalists do, but it also highlights the significant risks that they are exposed to on a daily basis. In South Africa, we haven't had journalists killed in the line of duty recently, but we know that there are a number of journalists that are attacked physically, journalists that are threatened online on an ongoing and repeated basis. So, just people that are trying to bring us the news and show us what's going on really are risking their lives. So it speaks to why it's so important that actually we get to the bottom of how it was that she came to be murdered. And those that are responsible need to be, taken to court and justice must be served.
Yeah, and I mean, in this particular instance, there's been finger pointing between two sides. Palestine is saying that this was definitely on Israel, that bullet that killed her. Israel saying that it could have also been Palestine's fault. So, I have no doubt, in two sides that have been warring for so many years. I mean, the death of one journalist, to them, it might not be as significant and not something for them for us or anyone really to actually get the truth. And how will we be able to get the truth when these two sides have been fighting for so many years? And already, as we can see, the finger pointing has already started.
Well, I think that's not that hard a problem to solve. You need an independent investigation into the circumstances to go gather the facts, gather the evidence, gather witness testimony, and all of those kinds of things. And that's how you'll reach some kind of conclusion as to what most likely happened. It's not any different to any other murder. And yes, life may be lost far too easily in several parts of the world. But when it's a journalist doing their job, not to suggest that their life counts for more, but because of the fact that they are there doing their job, it is important that we highlight that, and it is important that those that are responsible are held accountable, and whether that's here, and it's, we shouldn't only want to act when it's murder. We need to act in the sense that media fulfill a fundamental role to a democratic society. You cannot have a democracy if you don't have a free, fair, credible, and independent media. It's that simple. And if we accept that you want to live in a democracy, things that pose threats to that, in just the same way as if someone goes and tries to bomb Parliament or stop Parliament from operating or stop the judiciary from handing down judgments. Those kinds of things are clear and overt threats to democratic state. Attacking journalists are similar, clear and overt threats to undermining a democratic state. So these things it is about the murder of that journalist and about the enormous loss that her friends and loved ones must be experiencing, but it is also about a threat to media freedom, because it now means, what is the next journalist there going to go and be exposed to? This kind of thing has a chilling effect on many other journalists. It means that the areas are far more risky than they had perhaps allowed, but we know that thankfully there are going to be a number of journalists who will still go into those most harrowing and dangerous situations to bring us the news. And that's what we all need to, as those of us that are non-journalists, that aren't putting ourselves into danger like that, need to be appreciative of the fact that that is what's happening on a daily basis.
And, speaking of, free, fair, credible media, one has to ask, when covering stories about wars like the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and of course, more recently now, as we've been covering the Ukraine versus Russia, how should journalists be balanced on air? I mean, there's been some criticisms from the Russian side that, there has been no balanced reporting when it comes to reporting on the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine. And one wonders, if this is something that we need to be looking very much into in terms of how media doesn't end up looking biased and one side doesn't feel aggrieved by the reporting by media.
Look, it's often a deliberate tactic to undermine and say it wasn't us, or this reporting is biased. The SABC is subjected to that kind of critique on a regular basis, by various political parties, for example. And to a degree, if you're getting critique from all of them, it means you're probably doing the right kind of thing and being fair and accurate in what you're doing. And that's the test. Journalists need to make sure that they're being fair, that they're being accurate, that they are being transparent and accountable for the reports that they are producing. So when Russia comes and says, well, we're concerned the media is biased, they need to be able to present clear evidence of that. But, again, we need to then be taking the Russians to task for saying, well, yes, but you've severely curtailed freedom of expression in your own state in order to prevent people from understanding what's going on. So when we need to be critiquing them for the fact that they have effectively banned and censored most independent journalists in Russia. So it's not as though it's a value-free thing here. We need to be able to say the values that we're espousing need to be about accepted standards of ethical journalism. Journalists need to be able to go and say, we're being balanced, we're being accurate, we're being fair, we're being transparent and accountable. And if they can do those things, then in most instances, they aren't going to be overtly biased. Again, it doesn't solve the problem of those that are clearly biased and those that do seek to push some kind of an agenda, but journalists can only do what they can do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also it's important to ask, how journalists can keep safe while covering these sorts of stories. And I suppose it's really difficult to keep safe when you're trying to be on the front line and deliver the story, in these conflict areas where bullets are going off every now and then. I mean, is there a way that, and maybe I should be asking how journalists can in fact be kept safe? I mean, whose job is that to keep the journalists safe?
Well, obviously the employers have some role to play in this. They need to make sure that their journalists are conflict ready, that they have specialist training that when they go into a conflict scenario, they know how to look after themselves. They know what kind of situations to avoid. They know, what to do when they are in the middle of a hazardous and extremely dangerous situation. You can't just be sending them out there. But again, in this instance, the journalist was very experienced, and you can assume that she was taking all the normal kind of precautions that were necessary, and she was still murdered, and that's obviously just unacceptable. But again, for most journalists, it is about making sure that they get the mental support and therapy if necessary for when they have been exposed to these kinds of scenarios. But equally, they need specialist training, and journalists and media houses need to make sure that they provide that to all media professionals, really.
All right, Mr. Bird, thanks as always for weighing in. That's Director for Media Monitoring Africa, William Bird, weighing in on the tragedy, of course, in which Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh was shot while covering a story.